Hi, I'm Todd Pattison, the Conservator at the New England Historic Genealogical Society. And I wanted to talk to you for a few minutes about how to safely handle rare books. The most important thing to remember with books, or any kind of bound material, is that you have a range of sizes, a range of materials, a range of structures. All of them you need to look at differently. You can't just assume, oh, I handle every single book the same way. For instance, a large book is going to be very difficult to handle and to use, such as you might have with a large Bible like this. And a paperback is also going to be lighter, but sometimes more fragile because it doesn't have a stiff cover to it. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the importance of using a cradle with your book, or something to restrain the opening so it's not going to open flat. So for instance, in this book, if I just open this up, this is a very heavy, thick board on this Bible. If I open it up, it's just going to fall flat, and it puts a lot of strain in this one area. And while the book itself is very big and very heavy, the leather is no larger, no thicker, no stronger than it would be on a smaller size book. Now, you probably don't have cradles at your house, but you can make some very easily using some plain, clean towels. And so you would just want to take your towel and roll it up to form your cradle. So there's one side of the cradle. I can have a couple of other towels here that I fold in and roll up into different shapes. And then when I place the book into the cradle, and you might need some kind of weight to help hold everything and to get things set up, I'm not going to stress how this opens any more than it can really withstand. So now I can use it very safely. So there are two kind of separate parts of a bound volume. One is the binding itself, the exterior part, the spine, the cover, sometimes the end papers here, marbled end papers. And then the other part of a book are the pages, and the page attachment is what we're really thinking of. So to start with the binding, when a book opens, it's either going to have a tight back, where as it opens, the spine material stays tight towards the spine of the book, or it's going to have what's called a hollow back, so that as the book opens, the spine of the covering material or the spine of the binding moves away. And you can see here in the hollow back how that doesn't restrict the opening at all because the covering material falls away, where with the leather book that we just saw, the tight back, that covering material is kind of restricting the opening or making it harder to open the pages. So those are going to be very different in terms of the opening that you can use them at. Now in terms of page attachment, which is also going to affect opening, some books are sewn through the fold. So this 18th century volume, you can actually see the sewing and how it works through the paper cover. So being sewn through the fold, it means that these pages are one sheet of paper that gets sewn through. So there's a fold in that paper, and that allows this to open extremely well. Now other types of page attachments, which might be adhesive, they might be oversewn or stab sewn, where sewing goes near the spine but not through the folds, or in this case it's stapled in two places here, that really restricts the opening because that is gathering those pages closer in, not through the fold, so it's not going to open very well at all. So you have to really think about page attachment and also the type of binding. And then the last thing you want to think about is covering material. So this is a parchment covering material, so it's an animal skin like leather, but it generally tends to be stiffer, and so that's not going to want to fold or bend well, so it's very difficult for it to open. This one has actually been recovered at a later date. The primary binding was in the 17th century. The new leather covering was in the 18th century. That restricts that opening even more, so that when you try to use this volume, once you get to this point, you kind of have to force it to open more, and that's the one thing you want to avoid. You don't want to force a book open at all. Now, in terms of the pages themselves, you have a couple of different issues. One is brittle paper. So the more fragile the paper is, the more careful you have to use that book. So you can tell by the color of this paper, it's darker, that it is not as good a quality, and you run into things like tears, which you can see here. So as you're handling it, you have to be extremely careful with the pages so that you're not going to do any other damage. And then there are also sometimes books with fold-outs. So this book from the late 17th century has folded plates. And so this is another area where you have to be very careful in how you open something, because as this gets opened and closed, it causes strain on the fold, and that tends to become weaker. So you want to be very careful with any kind of damaged paper, any paper with tears, losses, or when you have fold-outs and you're trying to use them. All right, so once you've looked at the bound object and started to study it and see how the structure is, how does the covering material work with it, are there any loose parts, how is the page attachment, then you can go about setting up a cradle for it so that you can use it carefully. So the first thing to do is to see how far it wants to open on its own without you forcing it open. And so for this book, it's right around this spot. So I'm going to take my towels for my cradle, keeping it in that position, and letting it settle at that spot that it wants to settle. I'm not trying to force it any further. Now, when I go to use the pages, I want to try to use the upper foredge corner, this upper right-hand corner, and turn the pages that way. I don't want to try to pick the pages down here because you're more likely to do damage if you do that. So I'm going to use the upper foredge corner. I'm going to use my entire hand to move it over, and then just carefully make sure that as I go from page to page, that I don't have any issues in terms of tears or things like that. Now, sometimes you might need something to help you turn the pages, separate the pages, to move something. So I'm using a very dull butter knife here. I can't really cut the pages with this, but it can allow me to manipulate the pages if I need to. And so that might be a useful tool that you might have in your home setting. Now, sometimes as I use the volume and move from front to back, I get a shift in how the volume wants to sit open, and so I have to adjust my cradle to fit that. And then I may encounter places where this doesn't want to stay open very well, and yet I may want to take notes or maybe take an image of the page so that I can get the information, use it on my computer without having to sit at the book the entire time. So if you had something in your house, like we have this cable in our house that used to connect, I believe, our VCR to our cable. And so it's fairly pliable. It has a little bit of weight to it, and I can also kind of bend it into a shape. So I want to kind of bend it into the shape that I want this to sit at, and then place it on the book so that I can hold it open. Kind of like a snake weight. This would be called in a museum setting, because it's very thin, it's very long, and you can force it into different shapes. This book was fairly easy to use. Most of the time it stayed on its own, except maybe where there's a plate, but there are some other books where the book does not want to stay open at all. So let's go back to this parchment binding, and you can see it really doesn't want to open any more than that. More than this distance, I really have to force it. So if I put this into the cradle and try to use it, it's just going to close right again on me because it wants to be in that shape. So this is where I would really need to use a snake weight and get that in there. And you can see now it's going to hold it. If I need to use this at different parts of the page so that I can see the page, I can move it from the top to the bottom. And so I'm not opening this book very much at all, and yet I can still use it. I can still get the information that I need to get out of it, and so I can still protect it. So I hope this information has been helpful. The key points to keep in mind: every book is different. You can't just have one opening, one kind of cradle, one way that you're going to handle every single book because of the differences in them. There are two elements to the book that you really need to look at: the binding and the page attachment. And you have a tight back binding where the cover, as the book opens, moves in with the spine, and you have a hollow back binding where the covering material pulls away from the spine, and those are both going to affect how the book opens. And then the page attachment, sewn through the fold, tends to open better, and oversewn book or a stab sewn book or a stapled book or an adhesive book tends to hold those pages together near the spine, and so it doesn't open very well. And so always try to use a cradle, always open the book as little as you need to open the book, and just try to be safe with it and have fun using rare materials because they are designed to be used. Just handle them carefully and think about the things that you need to be aware of. Thank you.